The Ruby programming language was created by Japanese developer Yukihiro Matsumoto, better known as Mats. I've had the good fortune of getting to know Mats over the years. Here's a picture of me and Mats at RubyConf in 2012. Mats originally developed Ruby as an object-oriented scripting language that was influenced especially by the Perl programming language, and was also especially influenced by the languages Smalltalk and Lisp. This is some Ruby right here. This code comes from later in the tutorial. Our four main tools for executing Ruby programs will be an interactive prompt, also known as a REPL, which stands for Read, Evaluate, Print Loop, standalone Ruby files, like these ones here, shell scripts, which are files that can be executed themselves, and Ruby web applications running in a web server. In this chapter, we'll get started with all four techniques in the context of a particularly simple and classic program called Hello World. It's likely that you've seen one of these before. This tradition dates back to the early days of the C programming language. And by getting Hello World working in these four different ways, we'll have the necessary foundation to build up more complicated programs later on. Ruby, like much of modern computing, follows in the Unix tradition. So for example, I'm running Mac OS here, which includes, among other things, a Unix shell like this. And here I can type the command Ruby with the version number to see that I do have Ruby on my system. In this case, I'm using Ruby version 2.5.0, but the exact version number doesn't matter very much. Ruby is fairly stable at this point, and there's certainly nothing in this tutorial that will depend sensitively on minor differences in version number. Any recent version of Ruby should do. If you don't currently have Ruby on your system, now is the time to set things up. I especially recommend taking a look at Learn Enough Dev Environment to be Dangerous, which talks about the different options. It can be a little tricky to get Ruby installed, so in this first chapter, I'll show you how to do most things using the Cloud Ide recommended in Learn Enough Dev Environment to be Dangerous. Here's what the Cloud Ide looks like. It's got a file system viewer here, a text editor here, and a terminal right here. Let's make it a little bigger just so we can see it. And we can look here, running Ruby 2.4.1, and as mentioned, the exact version number doesn't really matter. This is perfectly good for doing this tutorial. By the way, I do recommend using Chrome if you're running the Cloud Ide. I have had some trouble running it in other browsers. Throughout most of this tutorial, I'll be using my native system, which in this case is iTerm for the terminal and Atom as an editor. But in this first chapter, I will show you how to do most things, both on the native system and in the Cloud Ide, just to help get you started. With that, let's move on to our first Hello World program, which involves running Ruby in a REPL.